Hi everyone, this is our very first lesson on the chapter of biological molecules, and by the end of this lesson, you will be able to describe what a biological molecule is and the different types of biological molecules that exist within our bodies. To begin with, let's break this term down. Biological means that it is coming from something that is living. Molecules obviously suggest that these are structures that are small molecules that should be found within a living organisms. So, biological molecules are molecules that are responsible for making up the living organism. There are many different types of biological molecules found between all living organisms, and each of them has a unique structure and function, and both of these things are very closely related to each other. Now, I know I said that these are molecules that are making up living organism, but you all must be wondering, how are they even doing that? They're actually doing that by forming different structures within any organism that is living. So, for example, biological molecules are responsible for making cell wall. They're also responsible for making the structure of a membrane. So, be it the cell membrane or be it any membrane that surrounds an organelle, it is made up by a biological molecule. Biological molecules also form the key component in the structure of skin and hair. Enzymes are also an example of one form of biological molecule. And so these biological molecules are actually forming the basic building blocks of any living thing. Without these biological molecules, the organisms that are considered living will actually fail to exist. But what does it even mean to be the basic building block of an organism? I'm sure you all are already aware of the organizational structure within any living organism, which suggests that there are cells which make up tissues, which end up making organs, and which eventually make up organ systems, and different organ systems end up making a single organism. But before the part where cell comes in, you now know that cells are made up of many different tiny structures which are called organelles. So these cell structures are actually responsible for making the cells. But these cell structures are also made up of something, and that's actually your biological molecules. Biological molecules end up making cell structures, for example, a cellulose cell wall, or a cell membrane, or microtubules, for example, inside the cell, are all examples of biological molecules. And these molecules end up forming these structures, which eventually ends up forming the cells. But since I'm constantly saying that these are molecules, and you must be able to recall that molecules were a combination of some specific atoms. And so it's basically atoms making up the biological molecules, which are then making up the cell structures, which are finally going to end up making the cells. These cells will then go on to organizing themselves into tissues, and different tissues will come together to form organs. These organs will together join up to form a single organ system, and many such organ systems will give rise to a single organism. And so, this is why biological molecules are actually considered the building blocks. They're basically forming the foundation of cell structures. If biological molecules did not exist, cell structures would not form. Without the formation of cell structures, there will be no cells. And without the cells, obviously, eventually there's going to be no organism. And so, biological molecules end up making the tiniest or smallest subunit of life, because it is these biological molecules that end up forming the basic building structure for the cell by forming cell structures, which includes different organelles and compartments of the cell. A natural follow-up question should be that what are the different kinds of biological molecules that exist that actually end up forming a living organism? And the answer to that is that there are 4 different categories of biological molecules. The first one and the most abundant one is a carbohydrate molecule. And these carbohydrate molecules end up making, for example, a cellulose cell wall or a starch molecule or even glycogen stores that store energy inside your body. Then the second kind of biological molecule is considered lipid. These lipids are the key components of all of your cell membrane and organelle membranes. So lipids are the key components inside of that. Similarly, proteins are actually considered the most crucial biological molecule to exist inside any organism, and that's because they actually form different structures inside any living organism. For example, microtubules, which are examples of alpha tubulin and beta tubulin molecules, are actually an example of a protein. So, proteins are essentially forming the entire cytoskeleton of the cell, which means without proteins, there will be no cell because there will be no structure to hold the cell in its perfect shape and size. Similarly, almost all enzymes inside a cell are also made up of proteins, and the cell is actually a powerhouse of many different metabolic chemical reactions, and those reactions will not proceed without the presence of enzymes. And enzymes are an example of proteins. Lastly, the last category of biological molecule is a nucleic acid. These nucleic acids are responsible for making DNA and RNA, and these are the structures that are actually forming your nucleus inside the cell. Almost all of these biological molecules are part of complex metabolic reactions that are occurring inside the cell. In the end, they give rise to structures that actually look extremely complex to understand. An example of metabolic reaction occurring inside the cell is that of protein synthesis. So, proteins are molecules or macromolecules that are actually synthesized from amino acid, which serves as its monomer. This is actually done through the process of transcription and translation because the code for what protein is going to form is stored on the DNA. And the process in which the DNA, which is part of a structure of chromosome, which is making up your nucleus, is called transcription and translation. So, when that process is occurring, and when a molecule of DNA is being read so that the protein can form from it, it can actually give rise to many different kinds of proteins because the DNA can actually code for extremely different kinds of protein within itself, which means that our body can actually have a wide variety of proteins. But there is an underlying simplicity in the entire process. The monomers making up protein are amino acids, and within any living organisms, there are only 20 amino acids available. So, no matter how complex a protein might be or how different one protein will be from another protein, the internal structure of that protein is going to be made up from the same amino acids. Those are 20 in number. They might be arranged differently and have a different combination, but the underlying structure will always consist of only those 20 amino acids. Similarly, the DNA can actually code for many different polypeptides or proteins because it has a different sequence of nucleotides. Nucleotides are structures that are making up the DNA. But there are only 4 different types of nucleotides available in our environment, which is why these 4 different nucleotides can arrange themselves in many different ways to give rise to extremely different kinds of protein. But regardless of how they're arranged and what is their order within the DNA molecule, they are actually going to only consist of 4 different nucleotides. So, regardless of the different codes that a DNA can store within itself, it's only going to be made from the 4 different nucleotides that are available. So, the final structure that a biological molecule forms tends to be extremely complex and unique, but each of them have an underlying simplicity because each of them are made of the same repeating units. Now, I've mentioned these monomers and these simple units or repeating units so many times without explaining what they are. So, before you get more confused and don't understand what I've just said, let me just go into the terminologies. Let me first summarize these terms in a sentence so that you can make sense out of it once I'm done explaining the terms. Biological molecules are an example of macromolecules. Some of these macromolecules are actually polymers that are made up of the same repeating subunits called monomers. Now I've thrown in three terms: macromolecule, polymer, and monomer. Macromolecule actually means that a molecule is extremely large in size. And so, be it nucleic acids, be it proteins, be it carbohydrate or lipids, are all examples of macromolecules because all of these are extremely large molecules. And here's the confusing bit. Every polymer is a macromolecule, but not every macromolecule is a polymer. I said some of these biological molecules are polymers. So that means all of these biological molecules are macromolecules, but only some of them are polymers, whereas others are not. Polymers is also an example of a very large molecule, which is why every polymer is a macromolecule. But polymers consist of the same repeating subunit. So, for example, a protein is an example of polypeptide, which means it is a polymer that is made up of the same repeating subunits, which is going to be your amino acid. And a single amino acid is actually the monomer of protein. So, monomer is the single basic subunit that ends up joining together to give rise to a larger molecule or a polymolecule that ends up forming the polymer or a macromolecule. All biological molecules are examples of a macromolecule, which means they're all giant and large molecules. So, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, protein, and fats are all examples of macromolecules. Out of these, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins are examples of polymers. Carbohydrates actually end up making polysaccharides. Another name for nucleic acids is polynucleotides, and proteins are actually forming polypeptide. The term poly in all of this is actually indicating many. So there are many saccharide molecules in carbohydrates. There are many nucleotide molecules in polynucleotides, which basically means nucleic acids, and there are many peptide molecules inside a protein. So, to summarize these terms, monomers are actually subunits, polymers are repeating subunits, or when these subunits join up together many times, which are either identical or similar to each other, they end up forming a polymer. And macromolecule is a molecule that is a giant molecule that have many molecules in it. They don't have to be identical to each other or the same subunit. It just needs to be actually a combination of many repeating molecules that may be different to each other or similar to each other. And so, in our examples, each biological molecule, which includes carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, and fats, are an example of macromolecule, and each of them have a monomer. So, the monomer for carbohydrate is a monosaccharide, which ends up making a polysaccharide for a polymer. So many such monosaccharides will join together to form a molecule of a polysaccharide. For nucleic acids, nucleotides are the monomers, and many nucleotides together end up joining together and form the nucleic acids or polynucleotides. In proteins, amino acids are the monomer for proteins, and many different amino acids join up together to form up a single molecule of polypeptide, which is the polymer of proteins. Fats are an example of macromolecule but don't really have a polymer structure, but they are still considered macromolecules, and they are made up of fatty acids and glycerols together. And fatty acid and glycerols end up forming the monomers of fats. These fatty acids and glycerols end up forming lipids, which is the macromolecule for fat. To reinforce this idea, let me give you an example. Beta glucose, for example, is a monomer of carbohydrate, or is an example of a monomer, monosaccharide, for carbohydrate. Many such beta glucose molecules join up together to give rise to a polysaccharide called cellulose, which is going to be the key component of cell walls in plant cells. And so, monomers are the simplest unit of a biological molecule, and these monomers join up together to give rise to a macromolecule or a polymer structure. Lastly, let's talk about a chemical molecule that is not exactly a biological molecule, but without it, we would actually not exist. And that molecule is a water molecule. Water molecules are not a structural part of any cell component. So, for example, they're not part of forming the cell membrane or any organelle or any specific structures inside the cell. But 80% of our bodies is actually water. So, all the cells that we have, for example, are bathed in a tissue fluid, and the key component of tissue fluid is water. Similarly, blood has plasma, which is also a form of liquid, so it has some amount of water in it. And so does the cell cytoplasm. Each and every single cell consists cytoplasm, which mainly consists of water and some salts. So this is actually the site where all of the reactions are occurring. And so if we lacked water, the cytoplasm, which is the site of most of the reactions inside a cell, will not be able to facilitate any metabolic reactions, and the organisms would not survive without water. And so, without water, all living reactions will cease to exist, which means all living organisms will cease to exist. Which is why we need to understand the structure and properties of this molecule to grasp how it allows us for all the essential functions of life that are occurring inside even the tiniest of cells. And with that, we've actually covered all of the biological molecules that exist, along with water that makes up almost 80% of all living organisms. And the purpose of this lesson was to introduce you to the different kinds of biological molecules that exist, and the next few lessons will now be building upon the general overview we've established in this lesson, and we will now be talking in depth about carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, lipids, and water in separate lessons. And with that, we conclude this lesson.